Well, good morning. This is Kyle Reese, Deputy Director of OneJax, and Nancy Bronner and I are here to do a special podcast of our show Faith Matters. As I guess as a generation, we are navigating uncharted waters, and so at OneJax, we want to bring the resources that we have to help the most people as possible. And so one of the best resources we have as an organization is our wonderful board of directors. And on that, there are several clergy members. And so we have invited a few of those clergy members who are able to be a part of this conversation today. And we offer this as a resource to you as we go through this COVID-19 pandemic together, and hope that it will be a source of strength and comfort. And we'll continue to offer resources as we are able in the interfaith space to serve as many people as possible. So I'm grateful today for our board members. Rabbi Elizabeth Bahar is with us, Reverend Claire Chance, and Dr. Steve Goyer. And so Nancy and I are glad to welcome all of you. And so as people who are in the midst of congregations and friend groups and all of the other relationships that you share, how is this pandemic creating anxiety in what you've observed and the people with whom you share life?
Well, we can look anywhere in society right now and see how this is creating anxiety. It's not special to churches or temples or any other kind of congregation. It's simply a time where we don't know what's next. And that's what causes anxiety for people. If you knew what tomorrow looked like, you wouldn't worry. But since we don't, we worry especially. And right now, I remind people that we never know what tomorrow looks like.
Right.
This is really not that different. We just need to be smart and cautious, certainly, but at the same time, remember where our faith lies.
Right.
This is Steve Goyer. I think anxiety is a natural and normal response to what we're facing. As Claire said, this really uncertain future, what it means and what it will bring and what it will change. And that anxiety serves a purpose, of course, evolutionally. I mean, if we weren't anxious, we'd do stupid stuff. And those who survived were those who were most anxious. So we inherited this anxious part of ourselves to live. However, when it takes over our lives and becomes the sort of dark cloud that follows us around, then it's not serving a purpose. It basically hijacks us. And so I think ways that help lower that anxiety and that fear, what does fear mean? Forget everything and run, which is the run, the fight or flight or fear response, or there's another one called false expectations appearing real, and that just means that all of a sudden we're imagining all the worst case scenarios. And so I think our spiritual lives and our faith life can help us bring some of that back into some sense of meaning and can give us hope even in the midst of what we're facing, and can even connect us in ways, even if we don't gather in congregations, we can connect spiritually, we can connect certainly by technology, but we can also, I think, connect to a story that's a lot bigger than this. The story that we get from the Old Covenant, what we call the Old Testament, and in the Protestant Church and the New Testament, those two stories born out of a place of crisis. That hope grows out of the crisis, and so from that perspective, I think as a community, as communities of faith, we have a lot to share with the world.
So one of the things that I think theologically about in this time just is that we're in the wilderness. This is Rabbi Elizabeth Bahar, and that all of the metaphors in the wilderness, come into play right now. I mean, the crazy thing is that we're daily in the wilderness, but because of society and the predictability of things, we don't recognize that. But the truth is that this moment in time makes us even more keenly aware that we happen to find ourselves in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, you don't know if the manna is going to come down from heaven, and you don't know if there will be enough quail the next day. And where will the water come? Where will our help come? How will we handle sickness and disease? Even Moses had to pray up to God when his sister Miriam was struck with leprosy, and they all had to stop. So it's a challenging and scary place to be, and yet it's also sometimes what's crazy is that the most rewarding things in our spiritual and religious lives come from the wilderness. We had revelation in the wilderness. We had divine experiences over and over again. Elijah went out to the mountain and heard God's voice. Moses went up the mountain and received the 10 Commandments. And there's again and again stories in our faith traditions where people go into the wilderness and have profound life-altering experiences. So perhaps that can be some sort of a silver lining, if there can be such a thing during this time.
I'm learning how dangerous this is, having a group of clergy start talking theology. So sit back and relax for the next 3 hours. But I'm interested in this idea of this image of wilderness, because I think it's true. I think a part of what is testing us is that part of the wilderness experience for many people is we are living without our distractions. Our sports distractions, our entertainment distractions. And so it strikes me that the wilderness is that place where a lot of the distractions are removed. But the wilderness is also that place where we can be keen on sounds and sights and give them a bigger voice or place than they should be.
Well, that's the challenge, I think, Kyle. This is Claire Chance. I think the challenge is to rise above the wilderness. In these wilderness times, when we don't have the same kinds of distractions, we have the opportunity to focus ourselves on what has greater meaning in our lives. We're not going to work in the same way every day. We're not doing the same things that we've always done. And when we stop in moments like that, we have a chance to think about what matters most.
Right.
What if today was the end of my life? What would I care about most? Who do I care about most? How do I build on those relationships? And not just in my own circle, but in the world itself. Who on my street would have trouble going grocery shopping? Who amongst my elderly relatives is in a nursing home and can't have visitors right now, and a phone call every day might be super important for them? Those things matter. Those things last. And as Steve was saying, when we elevate ourselves to think beyond the present moment, then we can focus on what always lasts. The Bible, and I'm talking Old and New Testament, mentions that God is our refuge over 100 times. Those repetitive messages are very meaningful to me. And especially in times like this when there's lots of uncertainty, there's one thing that's certain. God always was, God always is, and God always will be. And that is something that carries me through the storms of life, which I feel we're certainly in this particular wilderness.
I just want to respond, if it's okay, to something
Sure,
you said, Kyle, Rabbi Bahar, that we don't have our distractions. And we have become a society that thrives almost on having those gadgets and things to focus our attention on, so that we don't have to deal with the other things that that cause us discomfort. Those thoughts, those scary things, those noises in the night that we don't know where they come from. The other thing that I want to say and think about is that this is an opportunity to do exactly what you said, to allow ourselves to sit, perhaps even journal, do art, take a moment, take some time to pause and reflect on those uncomfortable feelings, explore where they come from, be gentle with yourself, and then start to really understand and process. I do recognize and feel the divine around me. And yes, I'm able to count my blessings even more so now, because I've allowed myself to sort of explore the fear and not do, as Dr. Goyer said, Steve said, run away from it, but actually sit there looking at it. Frankly, the gift that this is to be at home with those thoughts and to reflect on them and try to make something positive out of it.
In many ways, it's sort of a forced sabbatical.
Yes, a gift of time.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
It is, and so we're going off the map a little bit, which I love.
But you're a little anxious about that
But not me, but I know some friends who. Why is there such anxiety about that?
too. Going off the map.
Yes, all I can think about is how long is this going to last? When is what is that about me, Dr. Goyer, that I need to examine?
Well, I mean, nobody likes to be out of control, and so when we don't know what the map looks like, much less where we are on it, then we're pretty much lost. It's like, what's that old joke about why the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years? Because Moses would not stop and ask directions. Being a man, well, stereotypically men are the worst, but we're just humans, and none of us like to be out of control like that, and we don't like to be dependent. But now we are, and I think that's one of the gifts that's going to come from this is we're going to learn how connected we are. Mm-hmm. I mean, the virus reminds us of that, as does technology, but we're also going to learn how dependent we are on each other.
I think that we're both, and I want to say, just reflect also, we're connected both in the positive sense and the fact that we infect each other with the virus negatively, but in the positive sense, we don't want to be socially isolated. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to be sitting 6 feet away from somebody else. Reminds us how alone we are in the world, and that's a scary thing to feel. And we want to have that and crave that connection with other people. And so the virus not only reminds us how much we don't want to be alone, but also how we want that connection with others, and yet we can't. So sometimes the absence of something reminds us how valuable
How important it is.
It really is.
Right.
And also causes us to look beyond our connections with other people to think about our spiritual connections. Mm-hmm. And for people who are sheltering alone during this time, it's really important to remember you're not really alone.
Right.
God is always with us. And you don't have to be feeling so isolated in that sense. But at the same time, craving human connection, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, call somebody, and connect. That's okay. I think
it's imperative. I think.
I think so too.
That's what I think. This opportunity, again, the gift of time. If you look on Facebook and other ways, other organizations and agencies I know are doing online classes and trying to host services online and use Zoom and Google Classroom and all sorts of the plethora of platforms that exist out there to connect with people, because ultimately that's what they want. They don't want to be alone, even if it's via a screen.
So I'm wondering about one of the questions that I ask myself as we just sort of think about the rapid rate of change from this time last week to now. But one of the questions I ask myself as a personal spiritual discipline is, how will I be different as having to go through this? So talk a little bit about your own spiritual disciplines, not just in the face of COVID-19, but how do your own personal spiritual disciplines get you through anxious times?
I try to remember scripture, particular passages that bring comfort, not the least of which is Isaiah 40. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord will stand forever. Well, that reminds me, that there is a God, and I'm not God, that I'm impermanent and mortal. I try to remember that wonderful passage in Romans 8, nothing can separate us from the love of God, not even the coronavirus. I love the rituals especially the rituals of baptism that reminds us that we, in the truest sense, we die to ourselves and are born anew into Christ, we claim during that ritual. But also, here we are, it's Lent. That began with Ash Wednesday, when we had those ashes of impermanence placed on our foreheads, and we were reminded, from dust we shall come, and to dust we shall return. Now that, doesn't sound like such good news, but existentially, that's what we're most anxious about. Yet we have a faith that tells us that God is in that process with us, maybe through suffering, if nothing else, but also offers us the hope, as we say, the sure and certain hope of the resurrection. That's the hope we live into. The death does not have the last word. And so for me, I try to rest on those parts of my faith life. There are other spiritual wellness things that I do that I can get into later, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Well, that not at all. Someone
I was
else.
gonna say, for me, it's Rabbi Bahar. One of the Psalms that really brings me comfort, strange as it is Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Specifically, probably the strangest passage, and yet, what does it mean to be in the valley of the shadow of death? If you're in that valley, you have darkness and everything is scary and alone and isolating, and yet, even as I walk through that valley, I am most certainly not alone. God is with me, and I'm comforted by that fact. His rod and his staff comforts me, and before I know it, I'm sharing a table with my enemy. What is my enemy? It doesn't have to be my physical, tangible enemy, but the thing that really absolutely scares me. I'm face to face with that fear. I'm engaging in using in my mind, or one of the things that I do is a mindfulness practice almost daily, to just allow myself to accept and reflect and engage with the things that cause me trepidation, so that I can perhaps enjoy my cup that overfloweth with oil and wine and whatnot, and enjoy the bounty that is. And just a brief 1 minute word on mindfulness. It's easy to allow our thoughts to almost turn into a cyclone and just think about all of the negative, and then we spin up and spin up and spin up, or down, either way you want to go with that vortex. But one of the things that I think is also wonderful about mindfulness is that it reminds us that we don't have to choose to focus on those negative thoughts. We can choose to let those fear thoughts go up through our heads and allow the next positive thought to boil forward, so that we can hopefully try and focus ourselves and our attention on God, on love, on caring, on good things around us as well.
Good.
I'd love to build on what Rabbi Elizabeth has been talking about. It's ironic. I've been doing a series during the season of Lent on the wilderness and the Old Testament characters who show us how to live through wilderness times in our lives. And who knew, right? But at any rate, this past week I was talking about David. And my favorite psalm is the previous psalm to the one that Rabbi Elizabeth quoted. It's Psalm 22, which starts with David's deep suffering. He's running away from Saul. He has been completely cut off from other people for years, hiding in caves because Saul wants to kill him. And in that time, he writes those beautiful words, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's how that psalm starts. And of course, those are the same words that Jesus spoke on the cross. But as David goes through that psalm, he remembers in the time where he does not feel God's presence himself, he remembers how God has behaved with his forefathers and foremothers. And he remembers how God has always shown up. And he builds his faith again on what he has known from the past, from other people's experiences, as well as his own life. And he's convinced himself God will be faithful again. And it's that leap of faith, to me, that is so moving at the end of the Psalm 22, leading into the Shepherd's Psalm 23. At the end of Psalm 22, he says with confidence, I will stand up in the congregation of the people and say, I know you are God and you are good. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But to me, that's what we need to do now. It's hard. This is a wilderness time for sure. And there are legitimate fears. But faith overcomes fear. Because again, if we are but flotsam, if we are but ashes, and the truth is we're all going to die, then something much greater than us is the point. And that's what we need to be contemplating in this time that we have on our own.
Well, and I think that, boy, that theme, the something much greater than us, we could go spend a long time there. But Claire, it's interesting as I'm sitting there thinking, in the context of congregational ministries, one of the things that might be something that we could think about, should be thinking about, is how do we amplify those voices of people who have been there, done that? And I'm thinking especially our elders in our congregation, and I'm talking not by office but by age, who have seen a lot and experienced a lot and have the wisdom to say, yes, this is scary. We've never experienced this, but let me tell you what I've gone through, and let me tell you how God found me there. And God's going to find us in this. So the congregational resources are rich, and ways that we can think about amplifying those voices in the very population that continues to be most at risk in this pandemic. And so how it could be a task of pastoral care to find ways to amplify their voices in this time. As you continue to think about all of the things that we're experiencing, I want to ask you about resources, and you've talked about personal resources, but I want you to think about perhaps imagine a conversation where a friend, a congregant, whomever comes to you and says, Pastor, Rabbi, how do I get through this? What do you say to them, and what resources do you put in front of them to help them with that?
Well, I think there are lots of levels to that, certainly from just a materialistic level. Be safe, wash your hands, use hand sanitizer if you can find it, don't hoard. But on the deeper level, I think whether it's psychological or even more deeper existential, psychologically we get through it just like Elizabeth and Claire were saying, through exercises and practices of mindfulness, so that we don't get hijacked when the anxiety takes over, through deep breathing exercises, through meditation, through awareness of how your body is feeling and having a sort of conversation with that. And psychologically, there are lots of resources out there. By the way, and I don't work for Mayo, and the disclaimer is, but for $12.95 on Amazon, and they still deliver, you can get the best book on this and most accessible I've ever seen. It's called the Mayo Book of Happiness. Now, granted, I'm not sure there's anything such thing as true happiness in the midst of this, but it's all about exercises and practices to lower and dampen our anxiety. So but ultimately, existentially, I would say to my friend, this really forces us to ask the question, what is my life about? What matters?
Right.
And I can, decide to go out and buy a bunch of guns and ammunition and go that way, which is to say I've given in to fear.
Don't do that.
Or I can choose to be heroic. And I think that sort of heroism looks like courage and love. It looks like all the great leaders in the past have shown us, from the Bible all the way through. It's about selflessness and about service and about trying to make something good and meaningful in the midst of this, even as we're facing this really weird time.
In the Christian tradition, you all have mentioned the season of Lent that we are currently working through, and oftentimes it's that sense of, let us as a faith community put sacrifice upon you in the midst of your everyday life. But now it seems like everyday life is asking us to sacrifice, and hence the rub and hence the challenge. So that cost of sacrifice, I think, is very important in this time. What does it mean, and is that a practice that faith communities can teach to the community at large? I have 20-something-year-old children, and this whole concept of sacrifice is very hard for them in this pandemic. What are some other resources or things that we can offer the community as people of faith?
I'd love to hear the rabbi respond to that from her perspective.
So Way to put me on the spot.
We're among friends.
Right. But no, I think sacrifice is one of the things that, we're about to go into Passover season where we give up leavening. But leavening, I think, is just anything that, expands and pulls us away from God, or it can be if you understand it metaphorically or spiritually. But, I want to go back to the question you asked, even before this one, the one previous. Where is God in all of this a little bit, and what can our elders in our community teach us? So there was a quote found on the wall in the Warsaw Ghetto, and it says, "I believe in the sun even when it is not shining. I believe in love even when not feeling it. I believe in God even when God seems to be silent."
Amen.
It's a powerful thing when we're asked to give something for something that we're not sure is even necessarily going to work. And yet I look and see in China, there, the connections between people and the fact that they were so isolated, actually, their infection rate is so small. Now they're worried about reinfection from external, outside of China. But they were able to, through, I know it took 3 or 4 months, but during that time, do all of these things of social isolation and quarantining and separating and dealing with it to get it under control. And I have to believe that I have faith in seeing what happened over there and seeing that other people have had and gone through pandemics. 1918, this country's and the world saw a horrible pandemic. Rabbi Salanter, who was a rabbi of Musar in the late 1800s, talked about a cholera epidemic that his community was experiencing, and it was Yom Kippur, and he stood on the pulpit and said motzi and ate bread and drank water on the holiest day of the year, the day that we're supposed to be fasting because we're supposed to value life and food and sustenance and care of the body above other things. And so, he wanted to do that. So there's remarkable ways that we can look at our past of how faith leaders and leaders have approached, even today, illness and strife and truly motivate ourselves, toward making positive choices for not just our betterment, but the betterment of the community at large.
You know what I hear in what you're saying, Elizabeth? I hear you talking about balance.
Yeah.
And I think, as Steve referred to that in the very first thing that he was saying too, we need to balance between fear and faith. Mm-hmm. And fear, as you said, the anxiety can protect us. I mean, we should not be gathering in large groups. We should not be hugging, shaking hands, all of that stuff. That's just smart, right? But beyond that, we step out in faith. And I think that's something that the faith community really can offer the world right now. And that's so simple. It's thinking about other people's needs as well as our own. And that's in the grocery line. When you've stocked up and the person behind you has a few things and has a child with them, and let them go ahead of you. What difference does it make? What's your big rush, right? And there's so many little ways that we can really be kind to other people. That should be a key focus right now. And our own calm in the face of the storm is also something that we can offer the world. To be an island of sanity in the midst of chaos is a great gift. And I just think that that's what we're called to do. To stay calm, yes, to be careful and cautious, but at the same time, my church is going out on the streets and feeding homeless people very carefully, not touching, all of that stuff, but at the same time, making sure they have food. This is a balancing act that we're doing, and we shouldn't stop being people of faith just because there's a fearsome enemy.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things about authentic faith is we can say to one another, it's okay to be afraid. Because this is scary. It is scary for my 80-year-old mother who currently resides in a care center 2 miles from here. And so a lot of resources. Another resource that we want to let you know of is from Patty McElroy, who's the system administrator at Baptist Health, also a member of the OneJax board, but who was unable to be with us for obvious reasons, I would think, as she is working system-wide to provide spiritual care not only to patients and families, but certainly to physicians and nurses and all of the caregivers. But she reaches out to members of the clergy and says this: in response to the presence of COVID-19 in our community, Baptist Health has restricted visitation to all hospitals. to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This includes members of the clergy community. Spiritual care is especially vital at times like these, and Baptist Health is committed to caring for our patients' body, mind, and spirit. Therefore, we wanted to let you know that Baptist Health chaplains will be happy to visit your congregants who are in any of our hospitals until visitation restrictions are relaxed. So, as clergy who hear this, or members of congregations who hear this, please use this number, 904-202-2828, and that will get you into the administrative assistant for spiritual care, who will make sure that members of your faith community will be seen by a Baptist Health chaplain. So thank you all for this conversation, and this is kind of that trying to be creative in the midst of less than ideal times. We have been wanting to move toward a podcast for various things in OneJax, and so you all are the trailblazers. Yes?
Just one last point. One thing that can be calming when people are anxious is to try to keep some habits in place. And one habit that a lot of people are very used to is going to church or to synagogue or to their Islamic center on a regular basis, on a weekly basis. You can still do that, but not do it with your body. Do it with your computer. Because there's many services that are being internet streamed. I know my church has been doing that for years. You can find it on Avondale United Methodist Church's website. We have a YouTube channel. It's very simple. So if you are used to going to a service at 11 o'clock, go on your computer and participate. It will give your spirit a sense of calm in the midst of the storm.
And if your faith community doesn't stream, we talk about building community in the sense of isolation. What a great opportunity to connect to the larger community of whatever your faith tradition. Because there's somebody that is streaming something that will speak to you, and you can learn. Or you may just reaffirm and value your faith community and its tradition as you learn from others. So thank you all for being a part of this conversation, and thank you for all that you do in this community.
Thanks.